Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Machuda.
And welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. It's great to be with you today. My name is Gary Machuda, your host and sensei for this hour. Got a fantastic program in store for you. I honestly don't know what it's going to hold for us, but I know it's going to be packed full of very good, useful information, because we're going to be talking about the birth of secularism. You know, we find ourselves in the secularist society where religion is pushed to a corner. You know, we're basically told, that religious viewpoints aren't welcome in the public square. Just basically this huge divide between church and state and between religion and everything else in life. Where did it come from? What's the roots of secularism? How in the world did we move from Christendom to this kind of rabid secularism? Well, it's important for us to understand the roots of this so we can fight it, understand it better, and to help us do that, we're going to have Dr. Brad Gregory come on the other side of the break. As you know, he's the author of The Unintended Reformation, where he traces the philosophical roots, starting with Luther and the Protestant Reformation and its impact on society that ultimately gave birth to the secular mess that we're in today. So he has an incredible wealth of information. If any of you are familiar with Unintended Reformation, you know this is a very academic, very scholarly work. It's a bit of a thick weight, but I think it's worth the struggle. Because you will get a idea of the complexity involved in this evolution, or really a revolt that occurred, and we are still living it out today. So Dr. Gregory's going to be joining us on the other side of the break to chat about that. Also, I want to mention, in case you haven't heard, Virgin Most Powerful has a couple of very important special events coming up. And get your calendars out, folks. You know, pull out your iPhone or whatever. Flip to the calendar page because you want to mark down these dates. Saturday, June 13th, 2020. We're going to have Virgin Most Powerful's Men Conference, who's going to be headed by our good friends of Jesus 911. You know, Jesse Romero, Ruben Nava, and also Tim Gordon. You can register, by the way, for the Men's Conference at our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. And also, you don't want to miss this, Saturday, June 20, 2020. Can't miss that date. Virgin Most Powerful is going to do something really cool, especially for those who maybe you're feeling a little claustrophobic, kind of getting cabin fever. Well, guess what? You can go on a pilgrimage, a virtual pilgrimage with our very good friend Steve Ray, who, by the way, will be coming on the show this Friday on Hands-On Apologetics. But you don't want to miss that as well. So all the information is on virginmostpowerfulradio.org website. Check it out. Mark your calendars. If you haven't registered, please do, because there's great events in store for us. And let's see. I should give my shout-outs and welcome everybody, as I always do. Turning my attention to the social media section of the dojo, I want to welcome all of you watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the emojis. Very pretty. Spring-like emojis today on social media. And I also want to welcome all of you listening on radio stations around the United States and also via podcast around the world. Welcome aboard, folks. It's great to have you in the dojo with us as we look at the birth of secularism today. By the way, like I said, podcast, you can listen to podcasts. You can download previous programs from either our handy-dandy phone app or through our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Just go up to our shows, scroll down to Hands-On Apologetics, or, select whatever show you want, because there's lots of great shows that Virgin Most Powerful produces, and click it, and you can have access to previous shows. Just in case, Dr. Gregory's on, and you're really into the information, and you have to go to lunch, or something comes up, who knows. You can still listen to the whole program via podcast. Also, if you have any questions for Dr. Gregory, you can give us a call at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. And you can always email me, the sensei. You don't have to address me as sensei. But the email address, the official address to the dojo is questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's the official dojo mailbox. Love to hear from you, and I do reply. I do reply. Let's see. Anything else in store for us? No, I think we've covered all the bases. So while we jump into our routines, every episode we do some routines here in the dojo to strengthen our ability to think clearly and defend the faith. And we do that through our Finding the Fallacy segment. Today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is the appeal to spite. And we also meet an early church father. Today's early church father is Paulinus of Milan. So while we jump into the Finding the Fallacy, the appeal to spite, I think you pretty much get a picture of how this fallacy works. It is the argumentum ad odium for you Latinists out there. The appeal to spite is a fallacy in which someone attempts to win favor for an argument by exploiting existing feelings of bitterness, spite, and so on in the opposing party. So it is you can see how that could very easily dovetail into a propaganda technique, a way to influence people without evidence or argument. And this happens quite a bit. You find this in debates, especially, where a person who perhaps has a majority of the audience on his side may start bringing up incidents in the past to inflame anger against the other position's affiliation. For example, if it's a Protestant debating a Catholic, it's not unusual that the Protestant will try to inflame spite and anger, bitterness towards the opponent's position by, going to no popery history, talking about the Inquisition or something like that. And that is just simply not, that's used as a substitute for clear, solid evidence. And whenever that happens, that's the appeal to spite, which is informal fallacy, which is today's Finding the Fallacy. So keep that in mind, folks. And beware, because it is, if it sounds like something you could really discover very quickly when it's done against you. But beware if someone's doing it on the other side too. You have to kind of disallow what is said and try to think clearly and dispassionately about arguments, even if somebody might try to stoke anger against the other side. Okay, so meet the early church father. We have Paulinus of Milan, not exactly a household name. Paulinus was a cleric in Milan. Actually, he's a deacon, but although Isidore Seville calls him a priest, it remains doubtful that he ever advanced beyond the diaconate. As soon as 375 A.D., he received clerical training in Milan, and he served at that time as the secretary to the great Saint Ambrose. After Ambrose's death on April 4th, 397, Paulinus went to Africa, and there, under Augustine's influence, he wrote a life of St. Ambrose. His only other extant writing, by the way, is his denunciation of Celestius, addressed from Carthage to Pope Zosimus on November 8th, 417. So, not exactly a household name, and really his claim to fame comes from his life of St. Ambrose, which was highly influenced by Augustine. Ambrose had always been held in the greatest reverence by Augustine, who regarded him as the father of his conversion. And Augustine knew also the great bond of friendship that existed between Ambrose and Paulinus, and their long years of association, which gave Paulinus a better knowledge of Ambrose than pretty much anyone else. Consequently, upon meeting Paulinus in Africa, Augustine suggested to him that he ought to write an account of the life of Ambrose, and Paulinus' protest of his own unworthiness and lack of ability are, of course, no more than a literary device for the eloquence required for the task, which he was quite ably suited. And I just want to quote one quote from this Life of Ambrose. It's actually quite sweet, and it also has apologetics value in regards to the sacrament of confession. Ambrose rejoiced with those who rejoiced and wept with those who wept. For whenever someone confessed his sins to them and received penance, he so wept that he forced the penitent to weep too. For he considered that he was himself in a state similar to the penitent. But when cases of crimes were confessed to him, he spoke of it to none but the Lord alone, with whom he interceded. And thus he left a good example to lay to the intercessors with God, rather than to accusers among men. For even according to the apostle, love is to be confirmed in dealing with a person of this kind, for he has become his own accuser, who does not wait for, but anticipates the accuser, and thus by confessing he lightens his own sins, lest he has something of which the adversary might accuse him of. And so that's a great quote from Paulinus of Milan about St. Ambrose. Of course, it's talking about the sacrament of confession, penance, and also the seal of confession as well. Coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to be talking with Dr. Brad Gregory about the roots of secularism. Stay tuned, folks.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the Church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His Church, to aid and defend her.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Well, you know, we live in a secularized society where religion is compartmentalized apart from pretty much everything else in life. And you have to ask yourself, how is it that we moved from Christendom to the present state of affairs we're in? Well, to help us sort through the roots of this modern secularism, we have Dr. Brad Gregory. Dr. Gregory holds the Dorothy G. Griffith Chair in the Department of History at University of Notre Dame. Gregory's also a full professor of history at Notre Dame, where he is the director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies. He's the author of The Unintended Reformation, How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society, and also a newer book which covers roughly the same area, Rebel in the Ranks, Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the Conflicts That Continue to Shape Our World by Harper One. And Dr. Gregory, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I have to confess, I read your book a few years ago, and I was so impressed with it. You've always been on my list to bring on the show because you did stellar work looking at such a complex issue as, you know, the birth of secularism and its roots in the Protestant Reformation. I've been dying to have you on, so thank you so much for accepting my invitation. But I didn't know about this new book. I didn't know about this new book about Rebel in the Ranks. So this covers essentially the same area?
It does. Just to say a word about that book, and then we can focus on the unintended Reformation, if you wish, primarily. In anticipation of the year 2017, which was the 500th anniversary of what's usually regarded as the traditional beginning of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, I was approached, it must have been about the fall of 2015, and asked by a book agent working with Harper, would I be interested in writing something, a biography of Martin Luther for 2017? And long story short, I told them, I said, well, if I wrote a biography of Luther, I'm going to have a lot of competition, and you're going to have a lot of competition selling books, because I can tell you half a dozen of my colleagues who are working on just that. I said, but if you'd be interested in a book about starting with Martin Luther and talking about how, in unintentional ways, what he started in the early 16th century in Germany precipitated long-term unintended consequences that have led to the society in which we live today, not only in Western Europe, but also in North America. I would be very interested in a book like that. And so I cover similar ground in the more recent book, Rebel in the Ranks. But the other major difference between that book and The Unintended Reformation is that Rebel in the Ranks is intended for a broader audience. It's much shorter. It's less academic. Somebody could put it that way, and so it's reached a wider audience, I think, than The Unintended Reformation has. But the two books are very similar to one another in that they're trying to answer the question: how did we arrive at the kinds of standoffs, lack of comprehension, deep divisions, and the extent of a kind of an extremely heterogeneous religious and secular environment in which we find ourselves today, whether in the United States or in Britain or in Western European countries.
Yeah, very good. That's really great to know, because unintended Reformation really is an academic level type read. It's not something you could finish in a couple of hours.
No, even some of my scholarly colleagues have told me that I think it's a clear book, but it's a dense book, and I try to write as clearly as I can, but it covers, as you alluded to already, an enormous range. I mean, it's basically a reinterpretation of the last half millennium of Western history through trying to answer this particular question. How did we arrive at this particular combination that all of us experience today in our respective ways, namely overwhelming institutions that we have no choice but to participate in, namely global capitalism and sovereign nation states, the United States or Germany or whatever the case may be, on the one hand, and an extraordinary open-ended range of different people's beliefs and values and commitments and so forth, that the institutions are arranged so as to protect and maximize individuals being able to believe and lead their lives as they please. That's what the book is trying to understand. And what I didn't really realize before I got into it was it was going to involve as much as it did. So it's a lengthy and a kind of demanding book, but I think one with a lot of explanatory power, and one that, at least judging from many of my readers, repays serious engagement with, because it does, I think, help us to explain and account for a lot of the situation in which we find ourselves today in the early 21st century.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it does have great explanatory power. I've read it a few times, and every time I read it, I always come away with some new insights. I found as an author that often it's not so much what you want to include, but what that hard part. I was just curious, what was your selection process? Did you start at that end point and work your way back, or did you start, with the Reformation and work your way forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm laughing in part because, as I mentioned in my acknowledgments to the book, it is itself a book that was unintended, and by that I mean I was working. You'd have to be kind of a madman to set out to write a book like this, and it's so unconventional in the arrangement of the 6 chapters, in its expository method. It follows 6 stories in 6 different domains, each of which in a certain sense is telling the same story, but the story of how we pass from the late Middle Ages through the Reformation to responses to the Reformation to the present is a different story if we're talking primarily about the economy, for example, as opposed to the relationship between churches and states, as opposed to ethics and morality, as opposed to, say, higher education and the pursuit of knowledge. So that in and of it, that was really something that once the project started to come into focus, what I really wrestled with was, how am I going to actually put this on paper? How can you try and get some explanatory clarity to something that is so inherently complex and entangled? And that was the method I came up with, was I'm going to separate out these 6 aspects, as it were, telling you these things weren't really separate in reality, but in order to get insight into them, I'm going to, as it were, artificially separate them for the purposes of your understanding as the reader. But what I was really involved with, though, prior, and going back to my point about I didn't set out to write this book, I had signed a book contract with Harvard University Press. They also published my earlier book on martyrdom in the Reformation era, Christian martyrdom in the Reformation era. And I had they wanted me to write a book much more conventional, kind of a narrative history from late medieval Christianity through the Reformation period. And I had signed a contract for that, and I was working on that book. And it wasn't really going the way that I'd hoped. I didn't have the kind of fire in the belly, so to speak, and really kind of something original I thought to say. And while I was working on that, certain other kind of things that I was involved in intellectually and things I was reading and reflecting on started to coalesce in ways that I really did not expect. And I suppose the one of the key ones was recognizing that my interests in understanding the Catholic and Protestant and radical Protestant Christians of the Reformation era as a professional historian were in an unexpected way related to another of my scholarly interests, which is a critique of modern social scientific reductionist explanations of religion. And I have a background in philosophy as well, and so part of that latter interest comes out of that. But what I started to see was, these 19th and 20th century theories that try to explain religion are actually related to the intellectual reactions to the problems that arose out of the Reformation era themselves. And so what usually is kept separate, if you're a 16th century Reformation historian, what are you reading, 19th and 20th century, social scientific theory of religion for? these things are usually in different scholarly worlds. But what I started to think about was, you know what, these aren't parts of totally different histories. They're part of the same complicated long-term history. And once I started to think in those terms, lots of kind of pieces started to fall into place. And before I knew it, this book was in a certain way taking on a life of its own, and it just completely transformed what originally was a much more conventional narrative history of the Reformation era.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, because when you're dealing with a book that involves worldview, then that means the evidence you're using, some of the evidence is kind of foisted into this developing worldview as well. So you could, historical recounting of things will be put into categories that developed as part of this, initial change of. I don't want, if I say worldview, I'll be repeating myself over and over. But
no,
yeah, so
no,
you have to sort out the evidence. Right. Yeah.
And
yeah, that's
part of the. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh no, please continue.
I was just going to say, I mean, part of the challenge about that, with respect to worldview, is that just trying to get our mind around the character of Christianity in late medieval Europe and the extent to which it penetrated and was embedded and intertwined with things that now in our own lives in the early 21st century we regard as simply inherently different. The economy is not religion. Politics is not religion. Education is not religion, and so forth. None of those things was true circa 1500, and the ways in which the conflicts of the Reformation era, in a sense, inadvertently force the direction of those changes in what we now experience. That's really at the heart of my argument about how unintentionally secularization proceeded in a long-term way. It's the conflicts of the Reformation. Irony couldn't. Churches, their whole point in their respective ways is to try to make society more genuinely Christian than they thought it had been in the late medieval period. And what ends up happening for everyone involved eventually is that the combination of the conflicts that are involved and the rise really of an alternative to religion, which is the pursuit of material comfort and affluence that really comes to fruition only in the 20th century, which is not coincidentally when we see the strongest forms of secular behavior, even among, if I could put it this way, among religious believers themselves, really starts to take hold.
Very good. Well, I hear the music coming up. We're coming up to a break. We are chatting with Dr. Brad Gregory about the unintended Reformation and also Rebel in the Ranks, Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the conflicts that continue to shape our world. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR. Live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin's Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. We're chatting with Dr. Brad Gregory about his two books, Unintended Reformation and also Rebel in the Ranks. And Dr. Gregory, right before the break, you mentioned something really important, and that is, before the Reformation up to Reformation, the world was an integrated whole. Like there really wasn't much of a distinction between economics, politics, sacraments, duties to the church, duties to the states. So it was a unified whole. So what happened that began to break and separate these different spheres of life?
Well, I would, in a certain sense, the way you characterize it is right. I mean, there was certainly a much greater degree of interpenetration and mutual influence between spheres of life that we regard now as having become much more separate. But I would shy away from the term integrated whole only because as generations now of medieval historians have shown us, the extraordinary degree of local particularity, of all kinds of variety in late medieval Europe, institutions and beliefs and so forth that many Catholics are more familiar with in terms of when they use a term like medieval Christendom. The fact that, for example, whether you are in medieval Iceland or in medieval Poland, whether you're in southern Italy or you're in England in the year 1500, life is organized in terms of parishes and dioceses, and everybody except for very small numbers of Jews in a few areas in Europe is a baptized Christian, et cetera. Life is organized around the liturgical calendar, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are true. But at the same time, it would be misleading to infer from that all was well, or there were, no problems, or that somehow the Reformation just came out of nowhere and astoundingly and for no good reason had the sort of influence and success that it did starting in the late 15 teens. So I would say there's a combination of both enormous variety and shared culture and institutions in the late Middle Ages. The other thing that I think is absolutely critical and something that, in my experience, many Catholics tend to downplay when they think about the contrast between the Middle Ages, the Catholic Middle Ages on the one hand, and the Protestant Reformation on the other, is the long-standing, enormous, and multifarious gap that existed between Catholic ideals and teachings on the one hand and the lived realities and sad characteristics of so many aspects of medieval Christendom, not only on the eve of the Reformation, but indeed going back centuries. I mean, Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century is complaining about many of the same things that Savonarola is so concerned about in Florence in the 1490s, 3 centuries later. So I mention all this by way of background so that we don't get a misleading idea that there was a kind of idyllic, wonderful, sort of a concretized realization of the theology of Thomas Aquinas was basically what we should think about as we imagine medieval Christendom. And then here came this dissatisfied Augustinian friar named Martin Luther and wrecked everything. That is a totally misleading and indeed erroneous view of the relationship of late medieval Christendom to the emergence of the Reformation.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and that's a very important point to make. So what did Martin Luther and the Reformation bring to the fore that maybe it was latent in earlier periods? Actually, in your book, you even go back into philosophical roots with Islam and so on. What was the genius that set off the Protestant Reformation?
Well, I mean, again, I don't know that I would call it genius so much. I mean, that depends a lot on how one
maybe Genesis
Luther and what he claims. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly the influence was enormous. There's no doubt about that. I mean, it's difficult to boil it down to something simple. But I would say the critical difference between Martin Luther and the subsequent, not just the Protestant reformers that agree with him, but also the many who disagree with him, because as I emphasize in my own scholarship, as I think is incontestable on the basis of the sources, and has been known for a very long time, the Protestant Reformation from the very outset is not a unified movement. I mean, it would be completely just as misleading as it is to say the Catholic Middle Ages was an idyllic integrated whole. So too, it is utterly erroneous to imply that, well, Catholics had simply been ignoring the Bible. All you had to do was go and see what the Bible said. That's what Protestants did, and after that, that's the history of the Protestant Church. Well, that is not what happened. What of course happened is they turned to Scripture and disagreed vehemently about what it said, what it meant, how it should be applied, and so forth. So, but when I try to boil down for people the big difference between what happens with Luther and other Protestant reformers in contrast to those many Catholic reformers who saw, acknowledged, and in many instances spent their entire lives working to try to fix these problems. I mean, Catherine of Siena in the late 14th century goes to the Pope and says, basically, what are you doing here still in Avignon? Get back to Rome where you belong. And he actually listened and went. I mean, that took a lot of moxie for a woman and, a Dominican female in the 1370s. So these people themselves had dedicated, they did not mince words when it came to the sinfulness and the shortcomings of the church. The big difference with the Protestant reformers is that they conclude that the problems in the church are not simply that Catholicism and Catholic church teachings were not being properly lived out, that they weren't being properly instantiated. They conclude that the teachings themselves are false. The crucial teachings of Christianity itself, as embodied and taught by the church, are mistaken. And that, it seems to me, is the sort of bottom line critical difference. And for Luther, those derive ultimately from his view about the extent to which human beings are corrupted as a result of the fall, and about, in his view, the complete inability of human beings to do anything on their own behalf apart from God's grace. That really is if one of the views of human beings, the key differences between the Protestant reformers and Catholics for my students. I say it's basically a different answer to the question, how fallen are human beings? How fallen are human beings? If you think human beings have absolutely nothing left, original sin, onto which, in a Catholic understanding, right, grace can be grafted onto nature, there is no nature left that has any goodness whatsoever in it, according to Luther, according to Calvin and other Protestant reformers. That's not the case, of course, in a Catholic theological anthropology. Human nature is severely damaged by the fall, but it is not utterly, completely decimated. And that basic disagreement underwrites a lot of the doctrinal disagreements between Catholic and Protestants in the 16th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. And also, the other side of that equation as well is, like you said, the Reformation wasn't a unified whole. So it wasn't just Protestants versus Catholics. It was also Protestants versus Protestants, like Martin Luther against the Radical Reformation and so on.
Absolutely. And from the very beginning, from the very beginning. I cannot stress that enough. It's not as if, well, Luther's going along for a few years or a couple decades, and then a few people decide that they don't really like him so much. From the very beginning of Martin Luther's emergence as a public figure, 1520, 1521, there are other fellow reformers of his that disagree in fundamental ways. Luther forces out of his adoptive city of Wittenberg his co-reformer as a result of disagreements about the interpretation of Scripture, how church reform ought to proceed, the kind of worship that ought to be used, and so forth, and so on. So you cannot, nobody could maintain that it was just a simple matter of let's just get back to Scripture and get away from all this church tradition stuff, and suddenly that's going to open the floodgates of illumination, and the obvious truth of the gospel will shine through. I mean, that's just pure rhetoric and bears no resemblance at all to the history of the Reformation in the 16th century, or I will say, the history of Protestantism subsequently. And anybody who doubts that, all you have to do is do it now. Just put churches into your Google search engine and see what comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so why don't we start tracing it from there? We have two different things, the total corruption of human nature through original sin and this increasing splintering of Protestant sects. Starting with the doctrinal corruption, how does that feed into what eventually becomes secularism?
Well, I mean, and of course, it's hard to give a short answer to this, as we were talking about before. I mean, my book is complex, and it tries to cover a lot of things in a relatively short compass, even though it itself is a long book. So it's even harder to try to generalize about that.
Yeah, right.
But I guess the way I would put it is this: the biblical, the Protestant call, right, back to the Scriptures, sola scriptura, back to the Bible itself, yields not a single understanding of what the gospel is and what Christians are supposed to believe and do, but a contending range of different answers. At the same time, throughout the 16th and into the 17th centuries, of course, there are large areas of Europe, and we should bring in at this point the indispensable, for understanding, political dimension of this. No Protestant churches are able to survive in a sustained way unless they have sustained political protection from a prince or a ruler. And that's the same is true of those rulers who decide, even after the advent of the Reformation, to remain Catholic. So Charles V, for example, of Spain. And so this political aspect of the Reformation is extremely important, and maybe we can continue with that after the break.
Very good. Yeah, hold that thought. We're chatting with Dr. Brad Gregory about the unintended Reformation. Stay tuned, folks. More to come after the break.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He would kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. Mm-hmm. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show on the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Daniel, what a testimony, and I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we come to understand." According to St. Augustine, understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. May God grant us a strong living faith in Him and His divine plan of salvation, and help us to believe so that we may understand.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. And before we begin, I should remind everyone of two events. We have the men's conference on June 13th with Jesse Romero, Ruben Nava, and Tim Gordon. And also June 20th, we have a virtual pilgrimage with Steve Ray. You could go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and check out all the information there. And, Dr. Gregory, that actually brings us to, I think, to a pivotal moment where you have the splintering of these groups along with political splintering as well, where you have protectors both for Protestants and for Catholics. That ultimately ends up where religious conflict becomes warfare, armed conflict.
Absolutely, and if one of the most widely known aspects about the period I study, the Reformation era, the 16th century and up through the middle of the 17th century, is if people know anything about that period, they know about the wars of religion is the most common phrase. And as I refer to it in my book, Rebel in the Ranks, I think we should really call them the wars of more than religion, because religion was about so much more than religion, the way that we ordinarily understand it. But it's that, and we can understand why that is. This goes back to what I was talking about before, the understanding of how important Christianity is to people in this widespread culture at the time means that, and the way in which the exercise of political power and the oversight of economic practices and so forth, education and everything else is wrapped up and connected to religion, means that changes in religion are going to affect everything else. And so it's absolutely critical for stability in the society that there be a close connection and oversight with these religious changes that are going on. When you have a situation in which different political leaders are supporting and throwing all of their weight behind different and conflicting Christian churches, and show their willingness both to defend and to go to war in relationship to those convictions, you have a society that's in for a great deal of trouble. And that's what happens in the course of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century with the wars of more than religion. So the question then that's left, by the middle of the 17th century, we're in a situation in which Catholic and Protestant theologians are no closer to resolving any of those fundamental disagreements about the fallenness of human nature, the character of the sacraments, the proper exercise of ministry, worship, and so forth than they were more than a century before. You also have a Europe that is fundamentally exhausted as a result of the conflicts, the recurrent conflicts, whether we're talking about Germany in the 16th century or later in the first half of the 17th century in the 30 Years' War, whether we're talking about the French Wars of Religion, the English Revolution, and so forth. And so what starts to happen in the middle decades of the 17th century is the emergence of new kind philosophical and political ideas about how to create a framework, a worldview, to go back to a term that you used earlier, a worldview in which everyone might be permitted to believe what it is that they would want to believe on the individual level. And that's very important because, of course, there are families that are torn apart by the divisions within Christianity in the Reformation era. So the protections have to be at the level of individuals. This is something that is absolutely taken for granted by us in the United States today, right, with freedom of religion individual self-determination and all of that. None of that was the case in late medieval or Reformation Europe, and the people that first suggested it were regarded as nuts. But it is a consequence of recurrent, apparently irresolvable conflicts and disagreements about what is true with respect to the deposit of revelation and Christian truth. So and this is really where the unexpected kind of what becomes the sort of prototype for modern Western countries in this respect emerges in a very unexpected and unlikely place, and that is the new nation at the time of the Dutch Republic or the Netherlands. Americans sometimes refer to it in shorthand as Holland. Holland is the most important province within the Dutch Republic, but it's not the entire country. And what happens in the Dutch Republic is basically a recognition that if you pull back from the insistence that everybody needs to belong to the prescribed state-sponsored church, allow them to worship as they wish in private, at the same time that you allow everyone to participate increasingly in what at the time is the most dynamic commercial economy in Western Europe. The Dutch Republic is the first country in the world that creates a worldwide trading empire, and in fact really is the leaders in the creation of a European commercial capitalism in the 17th century. If you allow people basically to have those opportunities, you'll give everyone across the confessional divisions a chance to go shopping instead of continuing to fight about religion. And that's essentially what the Dutch do. Their success inspires other countries, most importantly, especially in the 18th century, England. And basically that becomes the prototype for the most influential form that secularization takes in the modern world. And it's a particularly, I think, insidious one because affluent and well-off Americans and Western Christians, they don't like to think about the ways in which the accumulation of ever more and better material things, rising standard of living and so forth is, let's just say, put it mildly, radically at odds with many, many passages in the Gospel and the other writings of the New Testament.
Yeah, I found that to be fascinating, that you end up with this weird reversal of, you call acquisitiveness, acquiring wealth as a kind of rejection against, the frugality, the, what do I want to say, the Christian impoverishment, that
absolutely
rejecting the things of the world for things of God.
I'll put it this way. I teach a whole course, a semester-long course at Notre Dame that is essentially a lecture course built mostly around one of the chapters from the Unintended Reformation, Chapter 5, it's the only chapter that has any claims to trying to be clever, and that is manufacturing the goods life. And I wanted to see if I could, with undergraduates, and our undergraduates at Notre Dame are fantastic, so I had high confidence that they would be able to follow it and get it. And indeed, over the years since I've been teaching it, they have. I come in the first day of class, and I say, I only want to know the answer, and I want to lead you to the answer to one question this whole semester, to one question, and it's this. How did the religious tradition in which avarice is a deadly sin, right, what we've just been talking about, you just alluded to, how did a religious tradition in which avarice or greed is a deadly sin give rise to the most acquisitive societies in the history of the world? That's our only question. And I said, now you might think it's simple, but it's going to take us a whole semester, and we're going to have to cover 1,000 years. We're going to go all the way back to the 11th century and the commercial revolution, the Gregorian revolution of the 11th century, and follow that story forward. And you'll see how the Reformation plays a crucial role in that. But that's part of my point, to try to get these students to see that things that happen in the distant past are still profoundly influencing us today. We just don't realize it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I try to do as a historian.
Yeah. Well, boy, sign me up for the course. I'd love to sit in. That sounds fascinating. You'll have to do some long-distance learning and put that online. Yeah, the one thing that really struck me with your book was, ironically, the birth of secularism was, I think, a movement for unity, to try to unify people. And what it eventually does is push religion into the corner, into its own hermetically sealed sphere of influence.
That's right. And I mean, basically, the place in the story, and this is a very important part of it as well, of the creation both of classic liberal political theory, and I say classic because I don't mean contemporary, like Democrats are liberals in the sense. I mean in the sense of John Locke, in the sense of the articulation of individual rights by the 17th and 18th century influential political theorists. Classic liberal political theory and the creation of democratic modern institutions that protect individual rights and so forth. Originally, the vast majority of people whose rights are being protected, of course, in beliefs, are religious views. But the protection of the right of the individual to believe what he or she wants to, which in the late 18th century means overwhelmingly one or another version of Christianity, or in a small minority key in the fledgling United States, just a handful of Jews, also is the political protection of unbelief. It's just not very widely exercised as such in those terms. And so I think lots of the drama and lots of the tension that we see playing out in recent years in our own country turns on that paradox, that the modern protection by political institutions of the individual right to believe religiously what one wants also is the right to believe irreligiously what one wants. And so the institutions that in a sense were a safety net created to facilitate the coexistence of religious traditions and churches and peoples who had demonstrated the difficulty of coexistence over the previous couple of centuries, have also facilitated the wide-scale flowering, if you want to use a positive term, I would say proliferation of all kinds of antithetical commitments and claims. And depending on the particular constellations that those assume at a given time, the results can be rather problematic. And I'm making a very veiled allusion to the current problems in our country at this very moment.
Yeah, very good. Well, I love that working premise of how history, is still alive and well today. We're really feeling the effects of it. We're coming up to the end of the program. How can people get a hold of the Unintended Reformation and Rebel in the Ranks?
Yeah, either one of those is available from booksellers. I would encourage them, if they're so inclined. I mean, the easiest thing, obviously, is to order from Amazon because that's an easy way to do it. But I would say if you can do it by supporting your independent bookseller, you can order either or both of those books from a local bookseller.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure, Gary. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's Dr. Brett Gregory. Yeah, check it out, folks. Rebel in the Ranks, or if you want real meaty presentation of this historical development, Unintended Reformation. Well, it's unbelievable. The hour is just flowing. Thank you so much for listening. Coming up next, we have High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. And it's time for me to sign off, so have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.